Gabe Spitzer, my editor, the guy behind the scenes, why are you here on the mic today?
Something must have gone terribly wrong.
I'm nervous.
No, I'm here because this is KUOW's winter membership drive. And so I am here just for a little special added something here at the top of today's episode. Scott, how are you with test taking, generally speaking?
I'm so good at test taking that I really didn't learn anything in school. Like multiple choice for me is just like, there's something about multiple choice that just gives me the answer. And I really finished college and thought I should have maybe studied a little bit harder.
Well, okay, I've got a little surprise for you. We're going to do a quick pop quiz, and I'm afraid these are going to be open-ended answers. There will be no multiple choice on this exam.
Great.
All right. But this is an honor of KUOW's long history in public radio. Of course, we've been doing this since 1952, and all thanks to listeners' donations. This is what keeps this station going and strong. And the way you can do it is go to KUOW.org/politics. Make a gift and, vote for sound politics. Vote to keep us alive and on the air and vibrant and all that kind of stuff. So, KUOW is one of the original NPR stations. It's been at it since 1952. And so in that spirit, I am going to quiz you on a few notable moments in Washington State radio history.
Ooh. Oh, I'm going to be so bad at this, but I'm so excited.
All right. Are you ready?
I'm excited to learn and fail.
All right, here we go. Question number 1, all right? The year is 1966. The station is KJR, one of the very first licensed stations in the city of Seattle. And we're about to hear from a famous Seattle radio personality who was like an absolute linchpin of the first wave of Seattle rock and roll. All right, here we go.
KJR, Seattle, Channel 95.
Coming to town on August the 8th, the 1966 Pacific Northwest Band Championships at the Aqua Theater. Here's the lineup. Down to the Good Times, Merrily and the Turnabouts, the Sonics, George Washington and the Cherry Bombs.
Scott, I see you covering your face with your hands.
1966.
What were you doing?
My dad was 17, if I remember, or 18 maybe. And so the name of this gentleman that we heard on the airwaves.
That's right.
Oh my gosh.
It'll be a name that you've heard before.
I'm going to have to phone a friend.
Okay. Can I be your friend?
Sure.
Okay. Scott, I think the answer is Pat O'Day.
Okay. Yes, that's a name I've heard before.
This rings a bell, right?
Yes.
He is a radio Hall of Famer and a crucial figure in Seattle area music scene as a radio host and a concert promoter. He was a really interesting, colorful dude and had a great voice. Yeah. Obviously. So anyway, all right. So we're over 1, but that's okay. That's why there's 3.
Okay, good.
Okay, this next one is maybe even a little more obscure, but we'll see how this goes. The year is 1938. The stations are KVI and KUOW, I think. And in the middle of a radio broadcast in Concrete, Washington, an unfortunately timed power outage literally sent people running out into the streets. Okay? Some of them had guns. Some of them were rushing off to their priest to make their confessions. Here is what they had just been listening to.
Private citizens and public officials, all of you, the urgent need of calm and resourceful action. Fortunately, this formidable enemy is still confined to a comparatively small area.
All right, Scott. So the question is, who was the enemy that scared the wits out of Concrete?
1938. Oh, man. I'm not incredibly confident on this, but at least I have an answer. It would be H.G. Wells' Martians in the War of the Worlds broadcast.
He directed the broadcast. I don't know if that was actually his voice doing voiceover or not, but you were absolutely right. The enemy was Martians.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good.
So in Concrete, during the War of the Worlds, they had a transformer blow up and knock power out to the whole town, and it just freaked everybody out. People literally thought that the Martians were attacking.
Incredible. I didn't know that. I knew, of course, about the War of the Worlds broadcast. Didn't know about the local connection, and I'm so happy to know that now. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. We're on to question number 3, the tiebreaker. The year is 1960-something, and the station is KRAB in Seattle. This is Crab Radio, a famous early listener-supported radio station. All right. One of the air shifts on Crab was occupied by a fellow named Tom Robbins, who would later on become a very, very famous author. And here's a little excerpt of him reading from his memoir about this oddball visitor that came up to the station one day, just kind of showed up and asked to play a song.
The guy had long, wild black hair, a pointed black beard, and wore a Mexican poncho across which, like a bandolier, was strapped a cheap guitar. There was a purity about him, a blaze in his eyes that bordered on the charismatic.
All right, so the question, Scott, is who was this young troubadour that Tom Robbins wound up turning away that day on the radio?
Oh, man. My dad is going to be really disappointed if I don't get this right. He'll say, where were you when I was playing all that classic rock when you grew up? Jimi Hendrix?
Nice try. I'm sorry. You want to take one more run at it?
Did he, would I remember him as a musician?
Probably not.
Okay, Charles Manson?
Yes, you got it.
Yes.
You got it. All right. Yeah, Tom Robbins missed the opportunity to have Charles Manson live on the air on KUOW, I'm afraid. I just want to say that you win nothing, except that you have enriched us with our state's history on the airwaves. And, KUOW has been a huge part of that history for more than 70 years. And so we owe this incredible run to our listeners who have stepped up time and time again to fund this station. So join now, go on to KUOW.org/politics and make a gift to help keep stuff like this podcast and everything that KUOW produces strong, vibrant, and on the air every day.
That's right. Go to KUOW.org/politics and you'll find that link right there. That's KUOW.org/politics and you can give today.
Scott, you did amazing. You got 2 out of 3, 2/3. That's like a super majority.
Yeah, right. And if we're talking super majorities, it must be time for Sound Politics. Welcome to Sound Politics, the show about the people and policies that affect your future in Washington state. I'm Scott Greenstone. As America zigs, Washington zags. That was the name of our election night episode. And you might remember hearing from a lot of places for days or even weeks post-election that Washington was the only state in the country where Trump did not gain ground compared with 2020. The national vote shifted toward Trump by about 6 points. But Washington is special in so many ways. One is we take our sweet time counting all the votes. And now that the election is certified, we can say with certainty, Washington state did swing toward Trump a little, about 1/4 percentage point. Still, that's less than any other state in the nation. So you have this across-the-board political shift toward Trump, and Washington barely budges. Why? What is Washington state missing that the rest of the country sees, or what do we see that they're missing? To answer that question, joining me today is Andrew Hong. Andrew is a data and research analyst with the Washington Community Alliance. He's also got experience working with HaystaqDNA, a Democratic-aligned analytics firm this past election. Hey, Andrew.
Hi, nice to be here.
And I'm also joined by Paul Graves. Paul is a former Republican state representative and is currently the president of Enterprise Washington, a campaign organization for the business community in Washington state. Paul, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Okay, well, the overall percentage of votes in Washington tipped a little toward Trump. He got about 50,000 fewer actual votes than 2020 because turnout's down, right? And candidates he endorsed lost in Congress to a Democrat and a Republican who voted to impeach him. So, Andrew, you're someone who dives into the data. Is Washington just somehow resistant to Trump's appeal? Like, why such a small shift?
Yeah, and I also want to note that it's not just in the last 4 years, but in the last 20 years, Washington state is not only just a blue state, but has been trending bluer relative to the rest of the nation for a while now. And I think there are many factors behind why the shift was so much smaller in Washington state towards Trump. 3 really stick out to me, though. Number one, the demographics of the state. 2, I think the ballot measures. We had 4 major ballot measures on the ballot this election. This is something different from 2020. I think that might have supported and helped Democrats across the ticket. And then thirdly, I think the Washington State Democratic Party has proven to be an effective party and a popular party in the last 8 years since they took control of the state legislature. Going to demographics, Washington State is a disproportionately college-educated state. It's also disproportionately white college-educated state, and these are about one of the few groups that Kamala Harris gained with since 2020 in Biden's performance. And so the fact that there are more people that white and college-educated voters that Democrats are getting with in the state, I think helped play a role in Democrats' better performance here. Additionally, ballot measures across the nation have shown to influence elections, not just on the actual initiative, but for other races up and down the ballot. And Washington voters soundly rejected Republican attempts to repeal major pieces of Democratic legislation. In fact, in many cases, these ballot measures were less popular than Republicans were. And I think that the popularity of these Democratic pieces of legislation, defending them, might have motivated Democrats to turn out more in Washington and support Harris as well as other Democrats up and down the ballot. And thirdly, I think that the Washington State Democrats, since taking control of the legislature in the last 8 years, have been very efficient in passing a lot of major pieces of legislation. And Washington voters have seen that results in ways that they haven't seen from really either party on a national level, and are more inclined to support Democrats as they continue to be effective and pass, as we've seen with the ballot measures, effective policies. You actually see from 2020, while Republicans, Donald Trump did slightly better amongst Washingtonians in 2024. If you tally up the votes from state elected officials running statewide from 2020, like governor to insurance commissioner, to 2024, Democrats actually did a little bit better the same year that Trump did a little better in the state.
That first question is something that I'm really curious. Paul, that demographic question, that's something you've talked about elsewhere. What are your thoughts on this idea that it comes down to the demographic makeup of Washington? Is our demography our destiny? And just in general, what's your take on the very tiny shift right in Washington?
It certainly matters. Andrew's absolutely right that Washington is a state that has more people than most states with college degrees and higher up. And white people with college degrees. I'll add, too, that Washington is a state that has a high number of people who say they have no religion or are atheists. And that was another group where Kamala Harris improved on Biden from 2020. I'll add a couple of other potential factors here, too, on the vote shift from 2020. First, Robert Kennedy Jr. was on Washington's ballot. He was not on the ballot in most states. He took about 1.5% of the vote. If you give, say, 3/4 of that to Donald Trump, which seems pretty reasonable to me, then that's about 1 percentage point more for Trump in the final ballot. And then out-migration probably matters at least a little bit too. Washington Republicans have been decamping to Idaho and Texas and Florida and other places, not for nothing, but the former chairman of the state Republican Party, Kirby Wilbur, now lives in Texas, runs a real estate agency aimed at encouraging Republicans to flee to Texas. And if that's even, say, 1% of the electorate from 2020 to 2024, that might explain part of the lesser shift here towards Trump as compared with the rest of the country.
Andrew, I know you want to talk about migration. Can you tell us, you've looked at those numbers too. I think more about in-migration than out-migration. Is that right?
I've looked at both, and on the net level, taking into account people moving into the state and people like Paul Graves said, moving out of the state, being Republican, the net shift is favorable to Democrats. You see Democrats from out of state moving in and Republicans moving out. However, I also want to note that that's also the case with Oregon, which is not just geographically, but demographically very similar to Washington State. And they had a larger shift towards Donald Trump. It was about 2 to 3%. And so while demography definitely plays a role, and Oregon also shifted right less than other states in the nation, I think other factors, including Washington State's Democratic pieces of legislation, these ballot measures, and effective ground operations from the Democratic side, help explain why, in a demographically similar state, Washington and Oregon, Washington State Democrats did a bit better this year.
Both of our local parties are claiming victories here, and I want to start with the Democrats. In an email this week, State Chair Shasti Conrad essentially said the National Democrats should look to Washington to figure out how to win after this big loss nationally. That was a paraphrase, but here's her words. We delivered the strongest Democratic performance in all 50 states. She pointed to the fact that Democrats won every statewide contest, like treasurer, auditor, for the first time in a long time. I think we were looking at this and it was like late 50s or early 60s since that's been true of an election. Looking at those statewide races, quote, Washington actually shifted 0.15% towards the Democratic Party in 2024. So that's removing Trump and Harris from the equation. And she chalks it up to a few things, right? A well-resourced, well-funded state party operation that works year-round and was the first in the nation to unionize, easy access to voting, right, mail-in ballots, and a Democratic Big Tent. Like in Congress, right, we have the chair of the most left-leaning Democratic coalition and the co-chair of the most conservative Democratic coalition, the Blue Dogs. And finally, her take, progressive policies are popular. So, Paul, what is your take on her take?
Well, you can certainly find, and you've seen both political party chairs are taking the data they have available and making the case that they did very well. That's a natural thing to do. Again, if you, the presidential race, again, Donald Trump did a quarter point better than he did in 2020. And you can look up and down both congressional races and legislative races. And what you got to give credit to the Democrats for, especially in swing districts like the 3rd Congressional District in Southwest Washington, is supporting candidates who disagree with them on some pretty important things. I mean, Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez just won for the second time a congressional district that Donald Trump won, and she did it in part by bucking her party on a number of issues, by most recently saying loudly that the pardon of Hunter Biden was inappropriate, and doing a number of things that have probably angered the Democratic base, but that appeal to independent and even Republican voters in the district. There's probably a lesson there for the Republican Party, too, that you need to work really hard on finding candidates who fit the district rather than who fit a rigid ideological mold.
Because I think if we go over right to the 4th district in Central Washington, you have Dan Newhouse, who voted to impeach Trump. There's no way he won that race without at least a few Democrat voters, I have to imagine.
It's a nice feature, from my point of view, of Washington's elections. We have a top 2 primary system where the top 2 vote getters, regardless of party, go on to the general election. And so that congressional race was 2 Republicans running against each other. One of them, Dan Newhouse, the incumbent,
right,
who voted to impeach Donald Trump, and his opponent, a Republican, Jared Sessler, who had Donald Trump's endorsement. And it looked pretty clearly like Dan Newhouse won that race by getting a good number of Republican votes, but then getting a lot of Democrats who didn't see a Democrat on that part of their ballot, nevertheless, to choose a person who was more in line with their views, even if he disagreed most of the time. And there may be a form of that in a lot of races in Washington where we've polarized ourselves and fewer districts are competitive. And so people from one party or the other are going to win. But if you have 2 choices there could be a lot of good work for some interesting differences between the parties, inside the parties themselves. And that could be a pretty big look into the future of where Washington politics and elections are going.
Andrew, I do want to have you respond to something on the other side. Jim Walsh and the state Republican Party have looked at these numbers and said that this past election showed that Republicans are actually getting more competitive in the state. And in a press release, they say that if you add up all their statewide races, the median percentage they got was 45%. That's still losing every race, but they say that's about 4 points better than they did in 2020. I am not a math person, so I confuse, median and average all the time. Walsh, at least feels the data shows Republicans are getting more competitive overall and closing that gap. Does that jive with what you're looking at, Andrew?
Yeah, using the median statistic means that he's only looking at one race, the middle race. When you actually take account to all of the races and do an average of them, you see that Democratic candidates on the state level, running statewide, did actually better than they did in 2020. And I think aggregating all of the races instead of just looking at one race is a better metric of success. And that shows not a 4% shift right, but actually a shift to the left. I'll add that the Washington State Dems added seats into their majorities in the state legislature and are now closer to a supermajority, a 2/3 supermajority, than losing the majority as a whole. They've also not just had successes on a state level, but on a federal level. Maria Cantwell performed better and won re-election with a larger margin than she did 6 years ago. There are now 8 Democrats representing the state in the House of Representatives. Additionally, on a county level, local level, you see Clark County Council went from a 4-1 Republican majority before 2024. Democrats flipped 2 seats and now are in a 3-2 majority. Additionally, in Pierce County, the outgoing Republican county executive is going to be replaced by a Democrat who just won this year. And so on all levels of government, and including aggregating all of the statewide Republican and Democratic candidates running this year, Democrats are gaining everywhere.
I'm getting this picture right now where it's this special little soup of Washington State being special and having its own fun little mix of demography, beliefs, values, but also this moment where these initiatives that were referendums on policies the Democrats, have passed came up and people said, these policies, we like these policies. And the Democrats made sure that some of the policies they're not quite as united on didn't come up to the ballot. Am I getting the right picture here, Andrew?
That picture aligns pretty well with mine. One note I'll just say on the ballot measures, going into this, polling showed that voters wanted to repeal a lot of these measures that Democrats have passed in the legislature.
Yeah.
And voters, once they learned about, the fiscal impact of repealing these reforms and just learned more about the policies, they turned around in the final weeks. And now we see these huge margins of victory that also aren't just because low propensity voters of color, younger voters turned out more. In fact, you see across the state, places where there are more voters of color actually had lower turnout, disproportionately lower turnout than 2020. And the data backs this up. When you compare split ticketing rates from the presidential race to the ballot measures, the greatest number of split ticket votes happened in rural, working class, and largely Republican districts and areas. Places in Eastern Washington, you saw huge margins, like upwards of 20, 30, 40% of people that are result difference between the presidential race voting for Donald Trump, but then going and supporting to keep especially capital gains tax.
Remarkable what you can do when you outspend your opponent's $35 million to $2 million.
Across the state, there was spending across the state, but these policies and ballot measures disproportionately resonated with Trump voters in Eastern Washington and rural areas. And there's, money can't really explain that.
Well, they spent the money to make the case, right? I mean, I guess that's the way it always is with money in elections. They, by the time it got to be general election, Let's Go Washington had spent a lot of its money just on getting the signatures and stuff like that. So I mean, money plays in, right?
Sure, money plays a role for sure. But when you look at the results of where these ballot measures performed better than Donald Trump, where you saw split ticketing, we're voting for Republican and then supporting these Democratic policies, they happened actually not in Seattle or Bellevue, where you see a lot more higher income folks, but in predominantly working class areas. Not saying, money of course plays a role, but also I want to shout out these organizations had ground game and volunteers working to protect these pieces of democratic legislation as well.
Paul, I want to ask you this question kind of going forward, looking to the future. Republicans have this tough job to do, right, in Washington State. A candidate would have to unite the Trump faction of the party, the old-fashioned Republicans, and maybe some disaffected Democrats, right? Win over some disaffected Democrats if that Republican candidate would want to win statewide. What would you advise a Republican statewide candidate thinking about, the future and running in this state?
Start off by thinking about the middle voter in the state. I worry Republicans too often run as if this is a swing state or if this is a conservative state. You really need to be talking to a working mom of two kids in Issaquah. and you need to be talking to them about the issues that actually matter to them, the ones that they actually care about. Those often aren't the ones that animate Republicans in more conservative states or more across the country. And we should probably look at the statewide elected officials who have had past success in the state. Kim Wyman won 3 Secretary of State races running as a moderate Republican who was just trying to be a competent elections official. Rob McKenna won 2 terms as Attorney General on a straightforward ticket of competence and public safety. And it was a month and a half ago that we lost Dan Evans, the most successful Republican elected official in the 20th century. And his first election, Barry Goldwater took 39% state as presidential candidate, and Dan Evans won with 55%. And Dan Evans' line that he's most known for is, "I'd rather cross the aisle than cross the people." And so I think it does require thinking about the middle voter, thinking about the things that they actually care about, and then crafting a message that will appeal to them and can focus on competence and public safety and cost of living and the things that the people of the state care about. And candidly, it also has to be a form of presentation, because polls suggest that while voters consistently say that the state is on the wrong track and there are serious problems with public safety and homelessness and cost of living, that voters overwhelmingly don't trust Republicans to address those issues. And until you can present candidates who are competent and who can talk in reasonable, sensible, measured Washington ways about Washington problems, I think it's going to be a real challenge.
Andrew, I want to ask you a version of this question. I was thinking about, I posted a TikTok about the results in the election, and someone commented something that is stuck in my head. They said, "Washington isn't the blue wall, we're the foundation." And I read that as obviously like the blue wall fell, like we're it. And I'm curious about your take on, this question of, should national Democrats look to Washington and the success of Democrats here for their next steps, or are we just this special snowflake of a state that what works here is not going to work in Wisconsin or Michigan? I'm curious what you think about that.
Well, I think that results are results, and Washington State produced better results especially as a Democratic Party than the other states. So I think, yes, national Democrats should look to Washington State as a blueprint. In particular, looking at where Democrats lost more votes nationally, it was predominantly in working class communities of color, looking at especially the Rio Grande Valley along the Mexican border in South Texas, which is heavily Mexican-American and heavily working class. Democrats have been losing those places in the last couple elections, and those trends are also seen nationally across similar communities. In Washington State, we did see a little rightward shifts amongst those groups, but they were far, far less bleeding amongst working class voters of color than other groups or than other states. And this is important to maintain support among working class voters of color that are the base of the Democratic Party. And Washington State has gone against headwinds to keep these voters more than other state Democratic parties have. And I think I credit the work of Democratic legislators and party officials in the past 8 years that have been effective in passing major pieces of legislation that get at the cost of living. We saw in this election, inflation and unaffordability was the number one issue, and that issue elected Donald Trump. In Washington State, again, we passed, I'll point to I-2109, the initiative to protect capital gains. Washingtonians overwhelmingly supported keeping this capital gains tax because it led to public funding of education and childcare, things that make the cost of living more affordable in Washington State. And this won thousands of Trump voters, not just in the western part of the state, but disproportionately in working class rural areas east of the mountains. And I think looking at Washington Democrats' activity in passing those types of economically populist reforms that disproportionately support working class people is a way forward to maintain support amongst not just working class voters of color, but expand our base to include working class rural voters that we've lost as a Democratic Party in the last 40 to 50 years as well.
Andrew Hong is a data and research analyst with the Washington Community Alliance. He's also with HaystaqDNA, a Democratic-aligned analytics firm this past election. And I'm also joined by Paul Graves. Paul is a former Republican state representative and currently the president of Enterprise Washington, a campaign organization for the business community in Washington state. Thank you both so much for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. Really appreciate it.
Today's episode was produced by Alec Cowan. It was edited by Gabe Spitzer, who also did the quiz at the beginning. I'm Scott Greenstone. Libby Dankman will be back on the pod next week. Get excited. Thank you for listening. And this show is only possible through donations from our listeners. So visit KUOW.org/politics to donate and keep our podcast and others like it going. And we want to know your thoughts on the pod. Share your feedback or your questions at soundpolitics@KUOW.org. Or leave us a good old-fashioned voicemail at 206-221-0511. See you next week.